Well, I refer to this little presentation as Lucy, she's no lady, and that's literally true. Current thinking is she's a male. So right off the bat, we've pretty well established the premise of this presentation. This will be a critical examination of the Australopithecines, and particularly the Australopithecine, Australopithecus afarensis. Don't let these big words fool you like Australopithecus. It simply means southern ape. When you see the word pithecus or pithecine, that means ape. And Australo means southern. So we will talk about southern apes. This is kind of a famous statue. It's appeared in a lot of T-shirts. It was built at the time of Darwin's publication of Origin of Species back in around 1925. I'm sorry, at the time of the Scopes trial, 1925, getting ahead of my story here. And we're not sure who made the sculpture. The original's in St. Louis. It's a little bronze affair, stands about 10, 12 inches tall. And the ape, of course, is studying a human skull, which is a little backwards, isn't it? That's the humor of the whole cartoon. The ape has a caliper here with which to measure the skull. He's sitting on a book. The book down here is Darwin, it says on it, I presume the Origin of Species. And he has his feet on a Bible. And the Bible is open to a page, and there we read the Latin inscription, which I won't attempt to pronounce because all Latin is Greek to me, and of course all Greek is Latin. But it says there, or makes a statement that Satan had given, "You shall be as gods." Now, sometimes there's debate over this very starting premise. In fact, it was a debate at the time of the Scopes trial whether Darwin really said that man came from monkeys or not. Today, if you say that Darwin claimed man came from monkeys, people will dispute that, and they'll say that evolution teaches that man came from ape-like creatures. An ape, by the way, is a monkey that doesn't have a tail. But Charles Darwin, in his book, The Descent of Man, did say that the Simiidae then branched off into two great stems, the New World and the Old World monkeys. And from the latter, that is the Old World monkeys, at a remote period of time, the wonder and the glory of the universe proceeded. So don't let anybody tell you Darwin never claimed that man came from monkeys. He did, in fact, claim in this book that we came from the Old World monkeys. The Gallup organization has done a number of surveys to see what people think about evolution and specifically the origin of man. And in several surveys ranging from 1982 to 1992, and there perhaps have been more recent ones, I think the results are still fairly similar, the following four questions were asked, or the following four choices were given. What do you believe about the origin of man? 1, God created man in his present form at one time within the past 10,000 years. 2, man has developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God guided this process. 3, same as above, except God had no part in the process. And 4, don't know, possibly don't care. Now, only 3 would be acceptable to professional evolutionists. Evolution does not want divine assistance. If evolution were to require or even accept divine assistance to make it work, evolution would be in the same fix as creation, wouldn't it? Couldn't teach it in the public schools because it would involve divine intervention. So the whole idea is that the evolutionary paradigm does not depend on divine intervention. The second choice is some kind of a combination of creation and evolution. Anything from progressive creation to theistic evolution. Well, the results of the poll are kind of interesting. About 45% of the people believe in creation. And this would be a quite literal creation, that God created man in essentially his present form sometime within the last 10,000 years. Theistic evolution, or a combination of creation and evolution, is also a significant number of Americans. Something a little under 40% perhaps. The evolutionary view, which is taught in our schools and our textbooks and on TV and what have you, holds less than 10% of the imaginations, I would say, of Americans. It's interesting that only 10% believe what we teach in our textbooks, and yet that 10% has a disproportionate impact, don't they, on our schools, on our newspapers, and I think on society at large. Relatively few people don't have an opinion on this subject. Probably less than 5% these days don't know or don't care about this issue. So it is an important issue and one that bears our attention. In the evolutionary view, chance is really ultimately behind the origin of man and all else. Jacques Monod, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in biochemistry in a book called Chance and Necessity, said, "Chance alone is at the source of every innovation of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, is at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution." Some years ago, Walt Stumper and I made a visit to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and they had just put on a multi-million-dollar exhibit on evolution at the time. And the exhibit had something rather like a little gambling casino. And this casino was to emphasize the role of chance in evolution. On your left there, you see what's called a dice layout. They have these things in gambling casinos, I've been told. And you throw the dice out on the table, and somehow these scores tally up, and in America we call this game craps. And over the top, as children throw the dice and what have you, have fun with this exhibit, a sign reads, "Is life just a game of craps?" That's kind of a heavy philosophical hit, isn't it, to lay on young people like you see here in the picture on the right, typical of a lot of the visitors who are enjoying this hands-on exhibit. To hit them with the whole concept that their very existence, their mothers, their fathers, their religion, everything, is just all one big game of craps. In the picture on the right, we see a one-armed bandit being vigorously cranked by the little gal. And above it, it says, over time, tiny mutations add up to big changes, suggesting, of course, that these changes could produce amoeba to men. Now, mutations really do occur in man, and this is a sad thing because chemicals and radiations that are mutagenic, that is, cause mutations, are oftentimes referred almost interchangeably as being carcinogenic, that is, cancer-forming. And as you sit here this evening listening to this lecture, the lights in the room are causing mutations to form in your skin. In fact, mutations are occurring spontaneously in your body at all times. And if these mutations were not repaired, most of the people I'm seeing in this room today would be long since deceased. Our very existence depends on a critical mutation repair system that is a very complex system in the body. This system involves at least 12 different enzymes that cut out and remove bad parts. Now, in this particular picture, we see what happens when this repair system doesn't work. This is a disease called xeroderma pigmentosa. One step out of perhaps 12 in the whole biochemical sequence for identifying mutations, cutting out the bad part, and splicing in a proper patch, one step is missing. And so mutations accumulate, such as melanoma here, and this soon proves fatal before reproductive age. In fact, DNA repair is so essential it's now considered to perhaps be one of the explanations for longevity. Those organisms that live the longest have the most efficient mutation repair systems. Of course, it wouldn't be necessary to repair mutations before the fall into sin, would it? This is something that's a feature of this life after the fall, and these mutations are being constantly repaired. Sadly, not all of them are repaired, and many problems accumulate. Well, evolutionists aren't so optimistic sometimes as they would like to make us believe. Richard Lowenton, a very distinguished evolutionist, geneticist at Harvard University, in the book Human Diversity, says that despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. Now, what is a hominid? You hear this expression quite a bit. A hominid is either a known ancestor of man or a collateral relative of man, or man himself. I would argue then the only really known hominid would be man himself, since I do not believe there are either known ancestors of man or collateral relatives. Today, Neanderthal man would be touted as something of a collateral relative, an individual who evolved simultaneously with man, when in fact Neanderthal man is just simply Homo sapiens. Now, you've seen a lot of these kinds of charts that show or purport to show evolution. And all of these charts, whether you're looking at whale evolution or the evolution of mammals or any other creature, are characterized with dotted lines. And if you read the fine print, the dotted lines mean that these are proposed or imagined scenarios of evolution. They do not represent hard data. They represent an interpretation of the data. Now, the bars you see here start at the beginning in the lower left corner with some presumed ancestor of the modern apes and man. The modern ape is up here. Man presumably would be over here. This is time from 5 million years ago to the present, so you can see most of hominid evolution is really a story of the last 5 million years, according to evolutionists. And the creature we'll be looking at in particular is Australopithecus afarensis, who becomes extinct presumably in the range of about 3 million years ago, somewhere between 4 and 3. I don't accept any of these dates, but we'll use the evolutionary assumption. The first thing I found kind of interesting about this chart is notice the cast of characters leading up to modern apes here. It would appear that the apes have been told, if you're interested in your ancestors, go out and find your own. There are a few suspects in here, but by and large, there's not a great deal of money, I don't think, in finding ancestors of living apes. So it's a shame to waste a primate. You find so few of them in the fossil record anyway, and to waste them as an ancestor of an ape seems a pity. So if at all possible, they're spent along the line leading to Homo. We could sub in a lot of different organisms with different names here. The basic story we'll look at today is a story of the Australopithecines. And you've probably heard of Australopithecus africanus. And that particular creature is now sort of pushed off to one side, sort of a collateral relative, a hominid that never quite made it to man. But one creature that is believed to be a sure enough ancestor is Australopithecus afarensis. Let's take a look at the story of the Australopithecines themselves. Trevor Palmer says, nevertheless, because the fossil gap, speculation has been rife for many years as to what gave rise to the Australopithecines. So we really don't know, or the evolutionists don't claim to know precisely where the Australopithecines themselves came from. The problem here is lack of data. If you took all of the fossils that are available out there, 95% of them would be marine invertebrates. The remaining 5% is everything else. Vertebrates would be a small fraction of 1%, and primates would be a tiny fraction of that. So no wonder we say that this is an area where the only certainty in this data-poor, imagination-rich, endlessly fascinating field is that there are plenty of surprises left to come. And indeed, we do find many surprises in this field. When I was at the Field Museum, and you see how imagination just goes bonkers, they did the exhibit up at the Field Museum on a carnival motif. And this was one of the banners here. You can see human ancestor with this perfectly outrageous painting, which I'm sure doesn't represent anything anyone is proposing as a real ancestor. But you can see imagination is allowed to just run wild, and I believe this is one of the problems with this whole field. It's data poor and imagination rich. Well, there are 3 ways to make an ape man if you think about it. I believe God created man, and so there is no such thing as a true ape man. Therefore, all of the so-called ape men are either apes that have been found in the fossil record that have been upscaled by emphasizing one or another feature that is human-like, or else they are humans that have been found in the fossil record that have been downscaled to de-emphasize their obvious human qualities, such as we've done with Neanderthal man. And then there is what I would call the true ape men. Does this surprise you that there are true ape men? This is where one finds specimens from apes in one location, specimens from humans in another location. The two are combined together and declared to be one individual. They are true ape men. Piltdown man was such a true ape man. Of course, they are either intentional hoaxes or unintentional confusion of data. Well, let's look at Lucy. Let's begin by saying, when we talk about Lucy, that this word Lucy is a name that we sometimes give to the whole species. The species is afarensis of the Australopithecines, and I think you'll admit to say Australopithecus afarensis several times in a row is a tongue twister. So if you don't mind, we'll just use the word Lucy to apply to all the representatives of this species, and there have been many, many such fossils found. And today I think the picture can be put together rather completely. Essentially all of the bones are in place, having been found in one specimen or another. But the first, or arguably the first, but certainly the most complete specimen of Australopithecus afarensis is the one called Lucy. And it was discovered by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia back in 1974. And it's been given a number of different ages. In fact, it was redated by Basil Cook using the Olmo pig-tooth specimens because the radiometric dating that had been done on this individual was unsatisfactory. It made it look entirely too young for such a primitive skull. And when Richard Leakey found KMNER 1470, which was far more human-looking, but was dated at an older date than Lucy, if you read Johanson's book, Lucy, The Beginnings of Humankind, you'll see they went to Basil Cook, had him redate both specimens to see if he couldn't adjust this out. And Basil Cook declared that Lucy was indeed older than they thought, went from about 2 million years or so to about 3 million years old, and 1470 was made younger. The thing that's interesting about afarensis is that it's about 40% complete. That is, about 40% of all of the bones were found reasonably together. And if you look at the skeleton here, a good part of the skull is missing, but other skulls have been located since, so we can put that together. There are no feet, just a couple little bones here, and no hands, but we have found other specimens that includes bones from the wrist and from the hands, and this will prove important in a bit, as well as bones from the feet. So taking all of the specimens, putting them together, we have a fairly complete idea of what Lucy looked like. So if this is an ancestor of Homo sapiens, we have a good chance of seeing it. This is the skull of Australopithecus afarensis, and when we look at the skull, right away we see that this is not a human skull. The most dramatic thing is, look at the face here. It slopes at an angle. We call this sort of a shovel face. And the human face goes up and down more vertically. This slopes. And the canines come in at a steep angle here, where human teeth would come down straight, the incisors and canines. The brow ridges are relatively large. There are some human beings, Australian Aboriginal, for example, that'll have a somewhat enlarged brow ridge. Neanderthal man had an enlarged brow ridge, probably not to the degree that we see here. But to me, the distinctive feature is the slope of the face. Very, very small cranial capacity. Cranial capacity of Lucy was small even by ape standards, so we're not going to confuse this skull with an ape. Another feature that I'll have occasion to bring up for those of you that want to stop by the table we'll be setting up tomorrow morning. I have $3,000 worth of hominid skull replicas, museum quality replicas with me, so you can kind of handle some of these skulls, including Lucy and even Piltdown man and Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus robustus, Africanus, afarensis, the Tong's child. I have life-size museum quality replicas of all of these. And when you look at them, you'll notice, when you compare them to human skulls, apes lack nasal bones. I always tell folks that if you just remember this, you'll have a good memory jog. Apes have trouble keeping their glasses up. If you feel right here where your glasses set, if you wear them, there's a pair of bones that come together here called the nasal bones. Apes don't have nasal bones. And then if you put the finger under the nose and you come up, there's a little bony spine that stops your finger from coming up. And that's called the nasal spine, and apes don't have a nasal spine. What do apes have? Well, if you look at the front of the ape here, no nasal bones, no nasal spine. If you look from the front, it looks like a jack-o'-lantern. You know how you cut the nose in the jack-o'-lantern? It's a triangular hole. That's the way this cavity looks in an ape. It's a rather just a triangular hole, whereas in human we have this, this distinctive bone structure. So all of these features are lacking. Is there anything about this skull that might get evolutionists excited? Well, the teeth are relatively small for an ape. There are other apes that have relatively small teeth, Theropithecus gelata and others. Another feature that excites people is that the teeth of the Australopithecines tend to have relatively thick enamel. You see, apes have, by and large, thin enamel, and humans have relatively thick enamel. But it turns out that there are some apes alive today that have relatively thick enamel, like the orangutan. And so the thickness of the enamel probably relates more to diet than it does to any kind of an evolutionary scenario or paradigm. Well, let's look at other parts of Lucy. It seems like every major city has their own Lucy statue these days if you go around to the different museums. And this is St. Louis's statue, so if you don't mind, I'll just focus on St. Louis's statue. This was built about, probably 15 years ago or more now. And when we look at this statue, it's very lifelike. It has real hair in the surface, and it's standing about this tall, not very tall. And if you look at the mannequin, you see some distinctive features. First of all, very ape-like head. But the trunk and the breasts and the genitalia are distinctly human for a female. The arms and the hands are distinctly human, though possibly a little bit longer proportion-wise than most modern humans. The legs and feet are very human. In fact, look at this leg. If you were to shave that leg, it could be used in a Hanes ad, I would think. And notice that Lucy knows a little bit about modeling, too. As every good model knows, if you point the toe, it tends to extend the leg. And she appears to be doing a bit of that. Also, the hand up like this and pensively looking off in the air tells you that very likely Johansen had found a fossilized thought. And I happen to know what the thought is that she's thinking at this very moment. She's just thinking, I don't have a thing to wear. But you see, once again, the artist is editorializing and fictionalizing, I believe, by putting into this creature this pensive look, this gaze, which leads one to believe that it is thinking. Well, given the fact that from the neck on down, this is essentially a human body, and from the neck on up, it is sadly an ape head, primitive even by ape standards, it has a powerful effect on people that go through the zoo. I've stood there and watched young children in particular go through big groups of them with classes. And you'll hear things like, oh, look, Mrs. Ferguson, an ape man. And Mrs. Ferguson points out, no, Johnny, that is an ape woman. So it's even politically correct, very difficult to deal with it. But see, you wouldn't have to know how to pronounce or spell Australopithecus afarensis. If you're a child, you just go through the museum, you look at it, ape head, human body, the message is very powerful. Now, this is a complete misrepresentation of the way Lucy looks, and the zoo has admitted that they were aware of this at the time they built the mannequin. But they do not intend to change it because, as they have pointed out, it gets across the point they want to make to the audience at large. What are the obvious misrepresentations here? Well, first of all, the hands and the feet. Let's just take a look at a little more detail here. There's the hand. You could play piano with a hand like this. or violin. Notice that the finger bones are straight. The whole hand has a very human-like quality. Apes have curved fingers. The finger bones, the phalanges, instead of being relatively straight, have a curvature to them, and so they have a kind of a meat hook looking hand that's quite distinctive, very well suited for being suspensory adapted or hanging from a limb, but not great for playing piano or pipe organ. Lucy here, the way she is shown, would be very good at the latter, not very good at hanging from limbs. Well, we know this isn't the case because even before the exhibit was made in the St. Louis Zoo, Stern and Sussman had published a paper in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, a rather sizable one at that. And in this paper, they looked at many of the Hadar Australopithecines, that is, of the type that Lucy represents, and they compared the curvature of her finger bones. Remember, Lucy herself didn't have finger bones, but there have been other specimens of Australopithecus afarensis that do, and so these bones have been compared, and you see them after the AL333 figure here, and the data points are here, and they're being compared to human, which is here, and other living apes. And what we see is, as you look at each of the different finger bones for living apes versus human versus Lucy, is that with an exceptional data point here and there, which may be a fragmentary fossil, the cluster is actually towards the most curved of the ape phalanges. So we could say that Lucy had highly curved fingers or phalanges by ape standards, the typical suspensory adapted type of hand. And this is not the hand shown on the creature that we have in the St. Louis Zoo. Now let's take a look at the feet. Well, first we'll say what Stern and Sussman concluded about the hand, then we'll look at the feet. Their conclusion was that a summary of the morphological and functional affinities of the Hadar hand leads inexorably to an image of a suspensory adapted hand, that is, hanging from a limb of a tree, surprisingly similar to the hands found in the small end of the pygmy chimp, common chimp range. So it would be completely inappropriate for anyone to paint or make a model of Lucy showing anything other than highly curved fingers. Another recent observation that was published is that these particular Australopithecines, which include afarensis, have been found to have locking wrist bones. And this is found in knuckle walkers. So that if you really wanted to show Lucy properly in the zoo, it would be a good idea to get her down on her knuckles, as any proper ape would be, doing a bit of knuckle walking. But that wouldn't get the impression across that certainly our zoo in St. Louis wants to get across, and I doubt many will go for it. Let's look at that foot. Have you ever seen a foot like that before? Sure you have. Kick off a shoe. Take a look. Your foot is probably not quite that hairy, but this is a distinctly human foot. There is no animal on Earth that has a foot remotely like the human foot. So this may be another misrepresentation, and once again, Stern and Sussman looked at the toe bones, the phalanges of the toe, and looked at their curvature. And the curvature, again, is at the high end of the apes. Here are the apes, and you're getting more curved as you go to the right. Here is the Hadar Australopithecine, the Lucy-like creature, and human is way over here, the bottom one, way to the left. So highly curved fingers and highly curved toes. And their conclusion from all of this is that there is no evidence that any existing primate has long curved, heavily muscled hands and feet for any other purpose than to meet the demands of full or part-time arboreal or tree life. But this again would not be the way Lucy is displayed in our museums. Recently, well, not terribly recently, this is 1996, but Discover magazine came out with an issue on how man began to walk. And I might say walking is a really complicated feature. We give a lecture at Washington University School of Medicine. I don't give it, but one of our anatomists does, who's expert in this area. An entire lecture involved in what is involved with just simply taking a step or two. And it's a very busy lecture. It involves lots of muscles, bones, and ligaments, and neuronal control. And basically, walking is a repeated effort to fall on your face, prevented by putting a foot forward. And the human gait, the way we walk, is distinctive. No other animal walks the way we do. You know, some years ago, I saw a movie on one of these things on television that comes on late at night that produce all kinds of weird, fascinating things. And it was about Bigfoot. Somebody had actually taken a home movie of Bigfoot. Have you seen this movie? It starts out, obviously, it's some guy dressed in an ape suit. And he's standing there looking back at the photographer to see when the photographer's ready. He clearly gets the nod and he starts to walk. And this is the way this ape-looking creature's walking. You know, he could be walking down the street in Long Island or something, but this is no ape. So we have a very distinctive gait. We'll talk about that in a bit. On the cover of this magazine, we see that the bones that they actually have are dark, and the light ones are bones that were added. Now, we have feet bones for Lucy, for the creature like Lucy, for Australopithecus afarensis, but I note that they interpret, that is, they show it in light, the foot. So rather than use any existing material, the foot is entirely speculated or interpreted. That allows them to put virtually human feet on this creature. Here they are. And the title of this article is, "Why Did We Ever Get Up on 2 Feet?" Now, those foot bones are completely different than the bones that actually belong to this fossil, which would have the highly curved toes. Why do they make the foot bones look this way? Well, they make them look this way because the evolutionary community is completely convinced that a creature like Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, made the footprints discovered by Mary Leakey in Lotoli in Tanzania. You've probably heard of these footprints. They're pretty amazing. It's a trail 73 feet long. It consists of 20 larger footprints in a distinctive human left-right stride, and 27 smaller footprints walking alongside. You can see the 2 trails, littler footprints here, bigger footprints here. The thing that's really amazing is that right smack dab on the top of each of the bigger footprints is a third footprint of a tiny little person. Now, how do you get footprints of little people on the top of every footprint matching the stride of a much bigger person? I heard Mary Leakey actually give a lecture on this at Washington University some years ago, shortly after she found it. And she was puzzled by this too. She said she just can't explain it. You know, some animals that are quadrupeds walk in their own footprints. But this is not a quadruped. This is a biped, no question. She said, you know, the Maasai, when they hunt, they step in one another's footprints to keep the noise down. And then, almost embarrassed, she said, and of course, little children like to walk in the footprints of their elders. And to do so, little children have to greatly increase their stride to hit every footprint down the line. I don't know how you can conclude that that's what's going on here. There are volcanoes in this area, and these volcanoes erupt to this day, and when they do, they produce an ash, and if it rains on the ash, it apparently sets up like concrete rather quickly. And these footprints were made, presumably, when there was ash on the ground from volcanoes, and when there was also rain occurring, and the footprints are just beautifully distinct. They have been buried for many years, of course, under a topsoil, but when the topsoil was removed and they saw one, they kept excavating, and they showed this whole trail 73 feet long. Now, the left-right stride is one of the best clues that this is absolutely human in appearance. No other creature, certainly no ape, has a left-right stride just the way ours would be. And even more importantly, the shape of the foot. This is one of the footprints when they were first uncovered, and they're quite clear. Now, tomorrow morning, I'm going to bring in all of these skulls, put them on a table out there. You can look at them. I'll be happy to discuss them with you. I have gorilla skulls and all kinds of other living primates, as well as hominids. I also have a cast of 4 footprints in a left-right stride from the Laetoli site, so of Laetoli footprints. But this cast was made when they were not as clear as this, because the footprints have been very quickly eroding away. In fact, they've recovered them again to prevent it. And I understand that even recovering them doesn't appear to really protect them. It makes you wonder how many million years old they are, if we can't even keep them going for a few years. But the human footprint you would not confuse with anyone else, because when the foot hits the ground, the heel hits first, you know that. And then as the foot slaps down, that's a left footprint you're seeing there. The weight runs along the outer margin, on the outer side of the body. The weight goes from the heel along the outer margin. Then it passes across the base of the toes. And then when we push off in our step, like this, the push-off foot, the big toe, makes a particularly deep impression because we push off in large part from that toe. Now, as I say, no ape has this particular pattern of the weight running along the outer margin across the base of the toes and pushing off from the big toe. Note that the big toe is in line with the foot, distinctly human. The small toes cling to the ground. There is a very well-developed arch. These are not flat feet, by the way. There's a very good arch in these individuals, and the weight is carried from heel around the lateral side of the foot, just as they are today. Now, everybody who studied these footprints when they were still fresh and very easy to see were absolutely unambiguous about their interpretation. In the book Lucy by Johansen and Eadie, they say, make no mistakes about it. They are like modern human footprints. If one were left in the sand of a California beach today and a 4-year-old were asked what it was, he would instantly say that somebody had walked there. He wouldn't be able to tell it from 100 other prints in the beach, nor would you. The external morphology is the same. I asked Mary Leakey, personally after the lecture at Washington University some years ago, the following question. I said, Dr. Leakey, I mean, you have the left-right strides, you have the little individual stepping on the bigger footprints. The footprints are virtually identical to the feet of modern, habitually unshod humans. That is, people who wear shoes get their toes all squished together, but if you don't wear shoes, your toes kind of open up a little more. That's the way these look. I said, why not just go ahead and consider the possibility that they could be human footprints? And in that tone of voice that the British reserved for the colonists, she said, oh, but surely you must know there were no humans around 3 million years ago. Oh, yeah, that's it. But you see, the preconceptions do not allow even considering the possibility that these are human footprints. Even though everybody agrees they look human, but they can't be, you see. And that's about the age of Lucy. So you see now why they have to put a human foot on Lucy, even though they know it wasn't human-like. It's sort of like the wicked stepdaughters, isn't it? And trying to wear the slipper, you know, the glass slipper, to get their feet into Cinderella's slipper, and they just couldn't make it fit. And I think that's the position the evolutionists are in today with the Laetoli footprints. They want to put Lucy's foot into those prints, but they really just aren't going to fly. For those of you that may have forgotten what a human foot looks like compared to a gorilla foot, take a look. I don't think you'd get too confused, would you? Do I have to tell you which one is which here? No, you pretty well. Notice they mention how the big toe is in line with the rest of the foot. You can see that in the Laetoli foot, whereas in the gorilla, the big toe goes off to the side here. And the very curved, grasping toes, these toes stay right down on the ground. These kind of curve and buckle up. So you wouldn't confuse either a foot or a footprint. Now, a lot has been said about Lucy's knee joint, and you hear people say, well, the two bones were found a long distance apart. I'm not really going to comment on that. I think we can learn a lot from the bones that we have that are undisputed here from the Australopithecines. And the knee joint is special in that Lucy and creatures like her were knock-kneed. And I bring this up because humans are also knock-kneed. By that, our femurs come together, and then our tibias go straight down. Now, there's a good reason for that. You see, if we had straight legs, our legs would be as far apart as our hips, and so particularly in women, they would be quite far apart. They go straight down because women have a broader hip to accommodate childbirth, right? So the legs would be apart. Now, you say, what's wrong with that? Well, one problem with that is if your legs are further apart, when you lift one leg, note what happens. I'll try to interrupt it before it gets too embarrassing. You see, you fall that way, don't you? And if you lift the other leg, you fall that way. Now, how would you prevent that from happening? Well, when you lift your left foot, to keep from falling to the left, if your legs are apart, you throw your weight over the planted foot, and that keeps you upright. When you lift your right foot, you throw your weight over your left planted foot. Now, see if you don't recognize this walk. An ape that has relatively straight legs will expend a fair amount of energy doing this as it walks, and he looks like this, right? Throwing the weight. Now, we don't have to do that because our femurs converge to the knees, keeps our feet under our body, and so as we lift one foot and another, only a slight amount of moving from side to side is necessary. Keep the weight over the foot. Now, hey, Lucy has this. Lucy has this angle. Here's a right femur and a tibia. And notice there is an angle. I'll exaggerate so you can see it. We call this the carrying angle, or the valgus. And the angle's measured right here. And if you look at the picture up here, you'll see that Lucy has a 15-degree carrying angle. We humans have about a 9-degree, so the Lucy-like creatures have a relatively high carrying angle compared to man. Well, there you go. Does that prove that this organism is evolving into man and that it has this carrying angle as we do, or sometimes it's called the valgus? Well, not really. You see, the gorilla has a 0 carrying angle. That's a straight leg. The chimp has a 0. But there are other primates, like the orangutan and the spider monkey, that have a pretty high carrying angle, pretty much in the range of man, 9 degrees. So you see, just because we have this angle doesn't necessarily mean that this creature is evolving into man, because we have modern primates that no one suggests are turning into people today who have it today. Now, your question might be, what are they doing with it? Ballet, perhaps? No, you see, animals that have these carrying angles oftentimes walk on limbs in trees, and that's like a tight wire walker, isn't it? And they'll oftentimes grab the upper limb and they'll go along like this and walk on the lower limb. And so there's an advantage for them to have a high carrying angle as well. Some evolutionists say, well, there you go, they pre-adapted in the trees and came down to the ground ready to roll. Well, there's more to walking than just the carrying angle. The point I want to make is you cannot show or prove that something is evolving into man simply because it has a carrying angle when you have living apes that have the same type of angle. Well, the other component, and I'll let Sussman and Stern comment on the knee. Since aside from the degree of valgus, the knee of the small hater hominid possesses no modern trait to any pronounced degree, and since many of these traits may not serve to specify the precise nature of the bipedality, he goes on to say that overall the structure of the knee is compatible with a significant degree of tree dwelling. In other words, it does not show a biped that walks as we do, one capable of making Latoli footprints. There's another feature that we need to look at. By the way, this is from that Discover magazine again, and take a look at those hands. You notice anything about the hands in this issue of Discover? There's the meat hooks we've been looking for, right? Those are not the type of fingers on the St. Louis Lucy. This is a far more accurate representation of the hand. Let's just crank it up there. See the long curved phalanges? You can get a good grip on the limbs with this. There's another feature that you see in Lucy. Animals that reach up and hang on limbs overhead, if you try it, it's not comfortable. Have you noticed that? You get your arms up here, it's not a comfortable position. There's a good reason for that, because the joint at the shoulder, if you drop by the table tomorrow, I can show you this in detail. The joint at the shoulder is kind of shallow. It's called the glenoid fossa, and the head of the humerus fits in there. And the arm can just go this high and no further before it reaches the limit of that joint. Now, folks say, well, wait a minute, I can bring my arm way up here. To do that, you have to rotate the whole shoulder blade. The scapula has to rotate to bring the arm higher. So we have to use a lot of muscles and rotate our scapula to get our arms up here. If you look at Lucy, she's clearly designed to be hanging from trees because the glenoid fossa is up-tilted. So she can raise her arm, or these creatures can raise their arms higher before they have to start rotating their scapula. The big problem, however, are the hips. As you know, all ladies are concerned about that, and so I would think Lucy is too. And let's look at these hip bones. There are really three bones that fit together to form the whole pelvis. I brought along the right piece of the human pelvis here. Fits right down here. And they're made of three different bones. The iliac part, the pubic part, which is right in front here, and right here is the ischium. These are the ischial tuberosities, and you are all sitting on your ischial tuberosities right now. That's what's supporting the weight through the gluteus maximus. Now, there's a distinct hip for apes and humans. And as far as I know, no overlap. You can't confuse an ape hip with a human hip. What's the big difference? Well, let me bring up a drawing that'll help to illustrate this. If you look at the top, that's a chimp. And at the bottom, that would be human. Notice the iliac blades of the human go front to back like this. It almost looks like a steering yoke on an airplane when you get them both together, right? As you look at it, isn't that sort of like a steering yoke on an airplane? See the handle here and the handle here, upside down? Whereas the ape, the iliac blades flare out laterally. So if I put this in place, in the human, this blade would be here, and the ape, it would be out here. Got the picture? This versus this. Now, why is that important? You need to have it this way if you're going to walk, as humans walk. Why is that so? My students tell me that I was, at one time or another, able to use almost every item of clothing on my body to illustrate things. Handkerchiefs can make muscles, and if we have a muscle that attaches to the iliac blade here called the gluteus medius, and that muscle comes down from here to here, right across there, and attaches to this bump on the femur. Now that's important because when we lift our left leg, think of an articulated dowel now. If you lift the leg, what's going to happen? If these are articulated joints at the hip, this hip's going to fall, isn't it? Lift the left leg, the left hip will fall. If I lift the right leg, the right hip will fall. What keeps this from happening? When I lift the left leg, the muscle that goes between here and here tightens up, and it keeps that from happening. See that? It's attached here. So if you don't have this orientation of the iliac blade, you cannot keep your posture as you walk perfectly even. Once again, you have to throw the weight back and forth to overcome this. Now on apes, the blade is like this. I've exaggerated a bit. The same muscle, gluteus medius, comes over the backside now. Notice that? It's going down the back. And apes have a center of gravity in front of their knees. They want to fall over forward anyway. And so this same muscle keeps them from falling further forward. So you can look at the pelvis and tell whether you're looking at an ape pelvis that cannot walk anything at all like we do, or a human pelvis. The big question is, what kind of pelvis does Lucy have? Well, Stern and Sussman said, the fact that the anterior portion of the iliac blade faces laterally in humans, he's talking at, this is facing lateral out here rather than over, but not in chimps is obvious. The marked resemblance of Lucy to the chimpanzee is equally obvious. So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Laetoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it. You'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So, well, I think perhaps the best way to conclude is to let an evolutionist himself conclude here. David Pilbeam is a very, very distinguished, and in my view, a very, very honest, as many are, evolutionist. And he has looked at the data, having spent a career studying the human fossil record. And in reviewing Leakey's book, Origins, some years ago, an American scientist, he had a moment of real candor. Listen to what this very famous human evolutionist has to say. My reservations concern not so much this book, but the whole subject of paleoanthropology. But introductory books or book reviews are hardly the place to argue that perhaps generations of students of human evolution, including myself, have been flailing about in the dark, that our database is too sparse, too slippery for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, the theories are more statements about us and ideology than about the past. Paleoanthropology reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about how humans came about. But that is heresy. Wow. No creationist ever put it any better than that. Why is this whole issue so important? Here's a picture that Ken and I and Carl and a lot of the other people on AIG show a great deal. And that is how we view our origins profoundly affects how we set our values and establish what is right, what is wrong, what is true, and what isn't. If we have descended from Adam, if he is our creator, and we are created by the handiwork of God in God's own image, albeit a fallen one at this time, then our absolutes come from God. God sets the rules and God communicates with man. But if we have ape in our past, then man has invented his own religions. He's written his own Bible. When he prays, he's probably just talking to himself, and his morality is relative. Man sets the rules. That leads to a host of problems that we see about us on all sides today, and that's why we at Answers in Genesis say we need to get back looking at Scripture from the very first verse, showing that God has indeed created man by the power of his word and has made us to be obedient to him, to hear and learn his word, to grow in the knowledge of his faith, and to be with him unto life eternal. We pray that that is the end of us all, and I would ask that in Jesus' name, and I thank you.